I'm Jason Carter. Physical optimization defines my life. The day I was born, doctors nearly killed me with medical malpractice. They said I'd never walk. I've been proving them wrong for 35 years. It's easier than you think to obtain super optimal health. I've devoted my life to it, and with my help, you can too. I'm Jason Carter, and this is ENZYMENTAL. And welcome to ENZYMENTAL. I'm Jason Carter, and today I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about chromium. I've mentioned chromium before, specifically in my videos on metabolic syndrome, or syndrome X as it's called, but I wanted to get a little bit deeper into what chromium is and how it functions. Chromium is a mineral that is essential to human health, and in its trivalent form, it's the only form that's found in food and supplements. Chromium is known as one of the safest of nutrients, and this is of course not to be confused with the hexavalent form, hexa meaning 6, otherwise known as chromium-6, which is toxic, and chromium-6 is not a nutrient and not encountered in food at all. So I'm not talking about chromium-6 at all. But dietary chromium and supplemental chromium plays a role in the body's use of energy-providing carbohydrates, protein, and fat, and when in short supply, chromium is associated with impaired glucose tolerance and diabetes-like symptoms. Insufficient chromium intake can result in diabetic symptoms, things like increased thirst, increased hunger, frequent trips to the bathroom, blurred vision, feeling tired most of the time, slow healing of sores and cuts and scrapes, and also frequent infections. These are all symptoms of some degree of diabetes. But also elevated insulin and blood glucose concentrations, which are also suggestive of diabetes, can lead to increased urinary excretion of chromium, so you can kind of see how this sets in motion a deadly cycle. Chromium is easy enough to find in food. You typically find it in meats, poultry, fish, grains, and other plant foods. A serving of meat, poultry, or fish typically provides 1 to 2 micrograms of chromium, so concentrations of chromium in plant foods are widely variable depending on the amount of chromium in the soil. Chromium is actually not essential for plants to grow. Brewer's yeast, also known as nutritional yeast, is a great source of supplemental chromium, and actually there are plenty of brewer's yeast companies that will add in even more chromium, so you can typically find brewer's yeast that's labeled as high chromium or high GTF, meaning glucose tolerance factor. That's another way to refer to chromium. Supplemental forms of chromium include chromium picolinate, chromium polynicotinate, and chromium chloride. Absorption of chromium picolinate, though limited, you typically absorb less than 4% of it, is still significantly greater than that of other forms, so that's one of the better forms you can take for absorption, the chromium picolinate. And it's easy enough to find at most health food stores. It's pretty cheap, too. This low percentage of absorption, again less than 4%, decreases even further when intake is increased. So that's why you'll see that most chromium as a supplement comes in pretty small doses, anywhere from 200 micrograms a day, which is about 167% of an adult's daily value, to as much as 500 micrograms a day, but not really beyond that, because, as an example, as I told you before, when you take chromium in healthy doses, one effect it has on you is that it tends to alleviate your cravings for sugar and simple carbohydrates, like sweets and bread and pasta. And when I started taking chromium, at the end of my sugar addiction, when I was in recovery, I noticed that, for the first time in my life, I didn't want sugar, and that's when I was taking 200 micrograms a day. And it was incredible. I never felt that way before, so I started taking larger doses of chromium, literally just handfuls of the stuff, and my sugar cravings actually came back. So I learned this firsthand, that again, with increased intake of chromium and even excessive intake of chromium, absorption of that chromium decreases exponentially. So if you're going to take chromium, really in this case, less really is more. So stick to about 200 to no more than 500 micrograms a day. And also, if you have any vitamin C lying around, take some vitamin C with chromium, because vitamin C considerably increases the absorption of chromium when taken together. So what happens when you're deficient in chromium? Chromium deficiency actually causes insulin resistance or accelerates insulin resistance, and supplementation with that adequate chromium overcomes that resistance very quickly. And if you're eating what I would call the standard American diet, which is a high intake of simple sugars and simple carbs and refined foods, that will cause increased urinary excretion of chromium, which in itself increases the requirement for chromium, as does also a high intake of phytic acid, otherwise known as phytates, which you typically find in most grains. Phytates are compounds that actually bind to minerals in your digestive tract, like chromium, and prevent their absorption. Also, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, otherwise known as NSAIDs, things that shut off your inflammatory response, these are typically what we find in most over-the-counter painkillers, have also resulted in increased urinary excretion of chromium. And also, if you're taking any kind of prescription antacid or over-the-counter antacid, this will reduce absorption of chromium even further. A serving size that's typically recommended, like I said, is 200 micrograms a day. I've seen it as high as 500, and actually studies have been done with people using 1,000 micrograms a day. But remember what I said, guys, when you take larger doses of chromium, the rate of absorption of that chromium is greatly decreased. So just stick to 200 micrograms a day. It might take a few weeks before you notice the effects of chromium on your blood sugar, and if you're like me and you crave sugar all day long, it's going to alleviate your cravings for sugar, but it might be a few weeks before that happens, and it's very subtle. It tends to actually whisper more than shout, so you'll notice that it just kind of quietly shows up one day and, oh, I don't need sugar today. I don't want sugar today. And if you're eating sugar, as I told you before, you'll find that you don't need as much of it as you did before when you're on chromium. So again, chromium is a very easy supplement to find. It's in most health food stores in the blood sugar set, and it's very cheap, so there really is no excuse not to take it. Thanks for watching. I'm Jason Carter. Go take some chromium, and I'll see you next time on ENZYMENTAL. Stay healthy.